Ciao a tutti, benvenuti alla Cucina di Buon Cibo. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Kitchen of Buon Cibo. I am Chef John Giovanni, and today we are going to be making oxtails in a Roman style. So I have some water boiling on the stove back here, and I'm going to begin by submerging these oxtails into the boiling water. And when the water begins to boil again, then I'm going to turn it off and let it sit there for a few minutes. Then I'm going to scrape all the impurities off. That's the reason that I'm doing this, because I want to boil some of the impurities and some of the fat off of these oxtails. And then I'm going to take them out and I'm going to put them on a tray and then sear them in the oven. So I'm going to drop these in the boiling water, and it should take just a minute. Okay, so I've let these boil, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take them out. And I have this baking sheet here, and I prepped it. I brushed a little bit. I used avocado oil on this, and I'm just going to take these. You can sear these in a pot or in a frying pan, but I'm going to do it this way because I can do them all at the same time. And I think it'll go faster, and it's not going to be quite as messy. So I'm going to put all these oxtails on this tray, and I'm going to drizzle them with olive oil. If you grab a spider, it looks better here. And then I'm going to put them on the broiler. So I'm going to check them every couple of minutes, turning them a little bit here and there until they're browned on the outside. And this I'm just going to discard. Just going to pour it right in there for now. So a little drizzle of olive oil over this. And I've already had the oven heating, or the broiler on, so I'm just going to pop these in there. And I'm going to be checking them every few minutes until they're browned and turning them. And while that's happening, here I have onions, carrots, celery, finely chopped, and I'm going to add that to a pan. I'm going to begin to saute it with a little bit of olive oil. Then I'm going to I have a cup of white wine here. I'm going to add this cup of white wine to it, and I'm going to let that cook until the wine dissipates or evaporates. Then I'm going to add a couple of tablespoons of tomato paste to it. Again, I like to use the tomato paste in the tube. And then here I had a 28 ounce can of tomatoes that, the recipe for this actually recommends that you hand crush them, but I kind of like the sauce smoother than that. So what I did was put them in a food processor and processed them till they were smooth. And then I'm going to add that. And once the vegetables have cooked and the meat is brown, I can put the meat back in. I'm going to add the tomatoes to it. And if it's not completely covered, then I'm going to add a little bit of wine to it, or water rather. And I'm going to let it cook in the oven for, I don't know, probably 2.5 hours. Okay, so I'm adding my sofrito, which is the carrot, celery, and onion, to this pan with the olive oil in it. And I'm going to put a little salt and pepper and a bay leaf in there. And I'm going to begin sauteing this, but the thing that is important is you don't want the heat too high. because you want the vegetables to soften, but you do not want them to caramelize or brown. So another ingredient I'm going to be adding to this is unsweetened chocolate. So this is like a tablespoon of unsweetened chocolate. I just broke it off of a bar that you'd use like for baking that you would melt chocolate for. And I am going to use my grater to just grate it up finely. And this I'm going to add to the sauce before I put the whole thing in the oven. So I'm just going to continue grating up this chocolate, checking my oxtail in the oven to make sure that it's browning properly and not burning. Keep turning it. Keep an eye on the vegetables to make sure that they don't brown too much. And keep grinding up the chocolate. Okay, so my vegetables are nicely softened now, so I'm going to take the white wine and I'm just going to add it straight into there. And I'm just going to allow this to cook until that wine evaporates. I've checked my oxtails in the oven. They were nice and brown on one side. I've turned them over to the other side. I'm going to let them keep cooking. And by the way, I have the broiler set on low, and I don't have the tray too close to the broiler because I don't want to scorch these ribs, or not ribs, the tails. I'd rather, it took a little longer to brown them than to burn them on the outside. So I'm going to keep cooking the vegetables here till the wine cooks out. And then I'm going to add the tomato paste and the browned ribs to the pot and put the whole thing in the oven on 350 degrees and just let it cook away there for, it's probably going to take about 2 to 2.5 hours. Okay, so also here I have 4 ribs of celery, and I'm going to cut them into about 1 inch long pieces, and I'm going to add these large pieces of celery to the cooking vegetables, if I can keep them falling on the floor, and let those cook for a few minutes before I start adding the rest of the liquid. And when they start to get a little bit soft, then I'm going to add the tomato paste to it, and then the liquid. We'll look at my oxtails and see how they're looking. They look pretty good. I'll let them just go for another minute. I'm going to be a little bit more brown. Okay, so I'm going to add the tomato paste now to the cooking vegetables. And I probably have like maybe 1/3 of a tube of tomato paste here. I'm probably going to use half of that, so it's ended up being like maybe 1.5 tablespoons or so. And I'm just going to squeeze it right into the pot. It's good. I'm going to save the rest of this because if I need to add cooking liquid to this later, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix this with a little bit of water. And then if I need to keep adding cooking liquid to it, I'll use the tomato paste and the water as my cooking liquid. So I'm going to keep stirring this. I want this tomato paste that I added to this to cook out. And what I mean by that is I want it to cook to a point where it's almost brown in color. It's probably going to take a little longer than what you think it should, and it might look a little browner than you think it should. But you really want to cook it well before you start adding the rest of the liquid. Okay, so my oxtails are out of the oven. We got a nice sear on them. Excuse me. A little pepper there, inhale. So now I'm going to add the tomatoes to the stock pot, and then I'm going to drop these in it. And if they're not completely submerged, I'm going to add a little bit of water to the pot until they're just covered. Then I'm going to let it come to a boil. I've turned the oven from the broiler to the oven setting, and I've set it for 350 degrees. Once this comes back to a boil, I'm going to put a lid on it, and I'm going to put it in the oven, and it's going to take about 2.5 to 3 hours. So I pulled this off of the stove, and I'm going to just drop these short ribs in here, nestle them in there nicely. I could have left it on the stove while I was doing this, but then I have my back to you. Not sure that's such a great thing, but unfortunately I don't have a cameraman, so I don't have anybody to follow me around with the camera. You could actually cook this on top of the stove, but it's a little bit warm in here today, and I don't know, I think it kind of makes the house a little bit hot. And the other thing I like about doing it in the oven is it seems to cook more gently in there, and then the oxtails get tender, but they sort of stand bum. They don't really fall apart. So I'm going to move this right there for now. So I'm going to try to show you that this pot, as you can see, they're almost submerged, but they're not quite submerged. So what I am going to do is I have a little bit of tomato left in this bowl. I'm just going to add some water to it, sort of switch it around and pour it over here until they're just covered. Then I'm going to put it back on the stove and let it come to a boil, put the lid on it, and then I'm going to put it in the oven. Now remember, I've changed the oven setting from the broiler setting to the bake setting, and I've set the oven at 350 degrees. So I've moved back to the stove with the oxtails. Now you'll find that once you've seared your oxtails that there's going to be a lot of fat in this tray. And I'm just going to pour it in this cup so you can see how much there is. So there's a good half a cup of fat there. So you have two choices here. You can either add this to your sauce and fat as flavor. You can use all or part of it or none of it, whichever you decide to use. Also, you'll see like there's a few little bits of marrow on here. You probably can't see that, but I'm going to take that marrow off of here and throw it into this pot. And I am going to add just about half of this fat back into this. So that's about 1/4 cup of it. And it started to begin to come back to a boil. So I am going to let it cook for just a few more minutes. I want it to have a pretty decent, boil on it before I move it to the oven. Then I'm going to put a lid on it and put it in the oven. Okay, so this has a decent boil on it now, so I am going to put the lid on it and put it into the preheated oven. On the center rack. And I'm just going to let it cook away in there for, like I said, 2.5 to 3 hours. I'm going to be checking it to see how tender it is. And then at the end, when we're finished, or when it's near finished cooking, I'm going to taste it, season it with salt and pepper as needed. Once it is finished, I'm going to take it off the heat and I'm going to sprinkle this chocolate over it and stir it in off the heat. And then it should be about ready to eat. So I'm not really sure. I'm trying to decide whether I want to serve this with polenta or whether I want to make like a nice saffron risotto. I'll do one of the two. I have some time to think about it, about 2.5 to 3 hours. So see you here in about 3 hours. So 3 hours have passed, I am going to, I've got the rice cooking back here on the stove. I decided to make rice. So I'm doing a saffron rice. And I'm just gonna take this out of the oven, put it up here. I checked it earlier by testing it with a fork to make sure that it was fork tender, that it's still holding together, which it is. Gonna give it a little stir. And now try to tip it up so you can see how it looks. Looks pretty good. And now I'm going to take the chocolate that I had grated earlier and sprinkle it over this. And then I'm just going to mix this in. And I've turned the oven down to 170 degrees just to keep this warm. And I'm going to put this back in the oven to keep it there until the rice is ready. It's probably going to take about half an hour for the rice. And I'm just turning these over to make sure that chocolate gets really well incorporated. And I'm going to taste it just a little bit to make sure there's enough salt. Super hot. I want to burn myself. I think it's got plenty of salt. It's good. Really good. Just going to leave it back up and put it back in the oven so that it stays warm. And then as soon as the rice is done, I'm going to plate it up. I'll take a couple of presentation pictures to show you at the end. And now it's actually a really easy dish to prepare. And oxtail is one of those things that, it used to be considered something that, well, it actually went through a period of time where it was considered a delicacy, and then it became more like an offal for people who really couldn't afford better cuts of meat. And now it seems to me like it's going back to being a delicacy because it's actually become quite expensive. I know when I was a kid, it was really cheap, and that's why we used to eat it all the time. So it's really a dish that's not difficult to make. It just takes time for all the collagen to break down in the oxtail and for the oxtail to get tender. So as I was saying earlier, I like to do it in the oven because it doesn't cook as hard. It's not boiling as much that way. It cooks at a slower pace. It's not as agitated, and it keeps the meat on the bone, which is where I like it to be. So we're going to be enjoying this for our dinner tonight. I'll take some photos of it as I plate it up. And hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please subscribe, share it with your friends, and I'll see you next time. Arrivederci.